Hi Guy, welcome back TV spoilers. CBS Beyond the Gate spoilers. Billy was used to shocks in Genoa City. Riving loud, spilling into headlines, whispered corners, and rooms packed with judgment. This one arrived in the coldest form possible: silence, paper, and Jill's signature. It didn't feel like an explosion. It felt like a clean, precise cue-tone that bled slowly but deep. When the will was opened, Billy walked into the room with the posture of a man who had just lost a pillar and with it, the right to fall apart. Jill was the kind of force who could make him furious, make him feel controlled, make him want to prove he wasn't a child forever trapped under the family's shadow. Yet she was also the last thread that kept him believing. There was some order to the Abbott world, twisted, toxic, and suffocating at times, but still a structure. He could argue with her, resent her, storm out and come back, but he always believed Jill, in the bitterest way, would tell him the truth about who people were inside that family. That is why he wasn't prepared for Jill to use her final words to shift the ground beneath him. He had braced himself for the familiar grief, regret, anger, the aching sense that he'd run out of time to fix anything. He hadn't braced himself for her to leave him a secret instead, timed perfectly so he could never demand answers. The will didn't need to be long to break him. It wasn't the money or the assets that mattered, not in the way everyone else in Genoa City would assume. A few lines were in Norton, with Jill's ruthless Claire tightening the document into a verdict. Billy read with the eyes of someone determined not to collapse, but the more he read, the tighter his chest became, as if an invisible hand was closing around his lungs. The room blurred. Sound drained away until all he could hear was blood pounding in his ears. And then the truth stood there, blunt and undeniable. The brother Billy had once believed was a distant shadow, a missing piece. A name Jill had kept locked away like a wound was Cain. Not a metaphor, not a rumor. Cain. For a moment, Billy couldn't even process the shape of the words. Cain wasn't a stranger. Cain was a name tied to years of Genoa City chaos, ambition, alliances, suspicion. The kind of history that always left residue. Billy had heard the stories, watched the fallout, dismissed details as not his problem because they weren't supposed to be his blood. But Jill's will rewrote the map of his life in an instant. It wasn't just a family secret. It was a rearrangement of every emotional rule Billy had ever lived by. He felt the shock in his bones, but the real damage came a heartbeat later. When betrayal rushed in behind it, Jill had known. Jill had carried this. Jill had decided when Billy deserved the truth, when it would hurt him most, and when she would no longer be there to face what she'd done. Billy's anger didn't erupt the way it usually did. It thickened, heavy and contained, like a storm trapped under his ribs. He wanted to believe Jill had a reason. He wanted to believe she'd done it out of protection. But another possibility slid into his mind like poison. Jill had controlled Billy's story. Even as she left it, she hadn't just written a will, she had written a trap. She had taken away his chance to argue, to demand, to break down, to be comforted, to rage at her and still somehow find a way back to her. This was Jill's final power moveth authority of absence. And it made Billy feel smaller than he had felt in years. Suddenly, every memory that involved Cain shifted color. Every appearance, every choice, every conflict Cain had ever been part of felt like evidence in a case Billy had never known. He was living inside. Billy began tearing through the past in his mind with the desperation of someone trying to find the moment he should have understood. Had Jill looked at Cain differently? Had she made decisions in the Abbott world with Cain in mind, while Billy was busy fighting to be seen at all? The questions multiplied faster than he could answer them, and each one carried a new edge of humiliation. Because if this was true, then Billy's life had been shaped around a truth he didn't get to touch. But the most brutal part wasn't only what Jill had done. It was what the truth was doing to Billy now. Cain wasn't just a brother, Cain was a warped mirror, reflecting every insecurity Billy had spent a lifetime trying to drown: his fear of being the disposable one, the second choice, the son who was kept close only because he was easier to manage. Billy had always lived under comparison, always felt measured against standards he never fully reached. The idea of an older brother, an entire person, Jill had turned that comparison into something primal. If Cain was the brother, then what did that make Billy? The son who stayed? The son who was raised to be controlled? The substitute Jill could mold while the real story remained locked away. The anger started reaching for Cain because anger always needed somewhere to land. Billy hated that about himself. He hated that his body wanted to blame a man who hadn't even spoken yet. He tried to separate truth from reaction, To hold onto the possibility that Cain might not know any of this either. That possibility mattered more than Billy wanted to admit, because it offered a narrow path out of pure hatred. If Cain had known, then Billy's entire life had been a game where he was the only one not given the rules. If Cain hadn't known, then maybe they were both victims of Jill in different ways shaped by her choices. Both denied something fundamental, both forced to carry consequences they didn't choose. Billy could feel himself hovering at the edge of the version of himself he feared most, one who exploded, destroyed, and then called it honesty. He could storm out and hunt Cain down immediately, demand confirmation, demand an explanation. Demand some kind of proof that this wasn't a cruel joke written from beyond the grave. He could turn a meeting into a catastrophe. And part of him wanted to, because a loud fight would be easier than sitting in quiet devastation. But Billy was tired of being the man who only reacted. He was tired of proving every rumor about him right. This secret hurt. But it also trapped him in a new kind of test. Would he become his worst self again? Or would he finally grow into the man Jill always demanded he be, without ever giving him the tools to become? Underneath the rage was another pain, sharper because it was softer. Billy wanted to grieve Jill. He wanted to remember her as the complicated, infuriating woman who still mattered to him. But grief kept getting hijacked by betrayal. And betrayal kept getting intensified by the fact that Jill was gone. He couldn't confront her. He couldn't get the story straight. He couldn't even tell if this was Jill trying to hurt him one last time or Jill trying to free him. In the only way she understood, be forcing him to face reality without her. Either way, the impact was the same. Billy was alone with the wreckage. And then the biggest question rose up. Not as curiosity but as a dare. If Cain and Billy were truly brothers, could they ever reunite? Reuniting wasn't a handshake. It wasn't a simple acceptance of blood. It meant accepting a history neither of them had been allowed to write. It meant doing something families in Genoa City almost never did, placing truth above power. Billy understood that one step toward Cain would drag Cain into a war Cain might not want. But if Billy didn't step forward, he would sentence himself to living like an abandoned man forever. Except now abandonment had a face and a name. Billy searched Jill's words for some sign that this wasn't only cruelty. He looked for a reason, for a note, for even a hint of humanity, something that explained why now. Why this way, why after death? But the more he read, the more Jill remained Jill, strategic, certain. Convinced that shock was the only language Billy truly listened to. And that realization twisted the knife again, because in some terrible way, Jill knew him. Billy didn't change when things were gentle. He changed when he was cornered. And now the corner had a name, Cain. By the end of the day, Billy sat alone with the truth, feeling as if Genoa City had shifted its axis. He couldn't tell if he was shaking from grief or from the realization that Jill had defined his life in ways he never consented to. But one thing was clear: if Cain was his brother, Billy had the right to reclaim his own story. And reclaiming it meant facing Cain, not the abstract past, not the family mythology, but the living man who might become either the answer Billy didn't expect or the next wound he couldn't survive. Billy stood, the will in his hand, like a ticket into the biggest war of his life. And just as he moved toward the door, his phone buzzed with a short alert about Cain's arrival back in town, forcing Billy to understand that he might not get to decide when this confrontation happens, because fate had already decided it would start tonight. Cain walked into the meeting with Billy carrying the posture of a man who believed he was delivering a clean win. In Genoa City, happy endings rarely last. So people like Cain learn to grip victory tightly before the world finds a way to steal it back. He came armed with concrete details, the kind that feel like armor in a town built on doubt. The takeover was officially complete. The final approvals were locked in. The legal team was already drafting contracts to seal the outcome into something irreversible. Cain spoke with the certainty of someone who had pushed through pressure, negotiations, and razor-thin timing and finally reached the finish line. He expected Billy to meet him there with a matching spark, relief, adrenaline. Even that restless excitement Billy often shows when he feels like life has handed him back a piece of control. In Cain's mind, this wasn't just business. This was the kind of result that could restore a man's sense of worth after too many falls. And if anyone in the city deserved that feeling, Cain believed it was Billy. But the moment Cain saw him, everything fell out of rhythm. Billy didn't light up. Billy didn't look like a man who had just been handed a long-awaited reward. Instead, there was a heaviness to him, an exhausted, muted discouragement that made Cain hesitate. As if the words "it's done" didn't lift Billy at all but somehow made him heavier. Billy sat with a silence that didn't read as calculation. It read as wear. It was the kind of quiet that comes from being trapped beneath something deeper than anger. Cain froze in confusion, because in their world people might play it cool, they might hide nerves. They might stay cautious because victory in Genoa City is always one step away from sabotage. Abbott. They rarely look empty in the face of something this big. Cain couldn't understand it. He wondered if Billy was running a psychological play. If Billy suspected something in the fine print. If Billy was simply refusing to show emotion to keep the upper hand. Cain had seen men weaponize feelings like currency. And Billy, in the past, was not unfamiliar with turning reaction into leverage. That's why this blankness unsettled Cain more than a burst of rage ever could. Cain tried to read Billy, but the longer he looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't cold strategy. It was erosion. Billy looked like a man who hadn't slept. Like someone whose mind had been looping a single nightmare. Until the outside world stopped mattering. Cain's confusion sharpened into irritation not because Billy seemed ungrateful, but because Cain couldn't stand the sensation of standing in front of someone who should be thrilled, and yet couldn't access joy at all. In Genoa City, when someone doesn't react the right way to good news, there's usually a secret underneath it. And Cain, even while carrying victory, was perceptive enough to recognize that something in Billy had shifted. Before this meeting ever began, Billy could feel Cain waiting, studying him like a problem to solve, and Billy hated that feeling. He was too tired to perform, too tired to pretend everything was fine. Because pretending would mean forcing another layer down on top of what was already suffocating him. So he let the discouragement show careless and honest in a way Billy rarely allows himself to be. And that honesty made the air between them tighten like a drawn wire. Billy didn't deny the value of what Cain was saying. He didn't dismiss the achievement. He simply couldn't grant it the top spot in his life right now. In that moment, Billy understood a brutal truth. Some good news arrives at the wrong time. And when it does, it stops being good and becomes a burden because it demands a smile from someone who is already cracking. That broken rhythm finally pushed Billy into saying the thing he knew would jolt Cain and maybe even offend him. Billy updated him on Jill's health, and there was no way to soften it into something manageable. Jill's cardiovascular condition was getting worse. And the way Billy framed it made it clear this wasn't the kind of worse that rest could fix. It was the kind of decline that turns everything into a race against time. Billy didn't dramatize it. He didn't use it as emotional leverage. He didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. He spoke like a man trying to keep his voice steady so he wouldn't shatter. Like someone staring at a future he can see approaching too fast and feeling powerless to stop it. For Cain, the information landed like a fist to the chest. Because if Billy had been subdued out of simple stress, Cain could have handled that. But if Billy's discouragement was rooted in Jill's fragility, this good news was now standing beside the possibility of loss, then Cain could understand why Billy couldn't celebrate. Cain wasn't a stranger to victories being eclipsed by tragedy. He knew the sickening feeling of finally achieving something and realizing it might not matter next to the health of someone who counts. And suddenly Cain understood why Billy hadn't said it sooner. Maybe Billy didn't have the room to. Maybe Billy had been carrying this so long it stopped being news and became a weight he just dragged everywhere. Billy advised that they shouldn't go public with the news yet. The reason wasn't image management or PR strategy. It was instinctive protection. Jill was in her weakest state. And any shock, even joyful shock, could become a strain on a body already struggling. Billy said it with a tension he didn't even try to hide. He was terrified of doing the wrong thing. Terrified that one small decision could become something he would regret for the rest of his life. Billy had lived inside cycles of regret long enough to know the scariest part isn't always the loss itself, it's the belief that you helped cause it through an avoidable mistake. So don't announce it wasn't just a suggestion. It was a quiet plea, give Jill more peace, even if it's only for a few days, a few weeks, a few fragile moments. Cain listened, caught between two instincts that fought inside him. One part of him wanted to respond like a practical man. If the takeover is done, transparency is the next step. If contracts are being drafted, momentum matters. Silence creates rumors, and rumors can destroy what they've built. But another part of Cain's part that rarely gets airtime in a town, obsessed with power, understood Billy's meaning at a deeper level. Some wins aren't worth trading for the fragile rhythm of a failing heart. Cain studied Billy more closely and realized Billy wasn't protecting Jill out of obligation alone. Billy was protecting Jill because she was one of the last forces, keeping him from drifting fully into self-destruct. If Jill collapsed, Billy wouldn't just lose family. He would lose the final anchor that let him believe he could still repair himself, still become better, still earn redemption before it was too late. The space between them charged with a quiet kind of electricity. Cain began to understand that Billy wasn't discouraged because he didn't value the achievement. He was discouraged because the achievement forced him to face a cruel reality. Time wasn't on their side. This win should have been something Jill got to see clearly, something Jill could feel proud of. something that proved every sacrifice had meant something. But if Jill was fading, then the wind became an aching question: did they move too slowly? Or was fate simply too merciless? Cain didn't want to think in tragedies, but Genoa City doesn't let anyone stay innocent for long. He knew that clean joy is rare here, and that knowledge made him want to cling to the victory while also fearing it might turn into another painful memory. Billy, on the other side, felt as if he had to convince not just Cain but himself that delaying the announcement was the right call. He hated being the man who asked someone to restrain their excitement. He hated turning a moment that should have been celebration into restraint and worry. But he hated even more the thought of Jill absorbing additional pressure, additional upheaval, additional attention from an entire city that never stops watching when her body was in a condition where every heartbeat mattered. Billy tried to keep his tone normal, but underneath it was a tremor, because behind this advice was the fear he couldn't say out loud. Jill might not have enough time left to witness what they've accomplished. And if that happened, Billy didn't know what would hold him upright anymore. There's something about this kind of scene that hits harder than the usual fireworks, at least for me. Imagining it on screen, it isn't built on screaming or threats. It's built on the tension of two men who have spent their lives using ambition to outrun fear. And suddenly fear wins. Moments like this are what make why and are feel worth it when success loses its shine. Because loss is standing too close. When the spotlight of victory is swallowed by the shadow of what might be taken away. Billy here isn't just the impulsive wrecking ball everyone expects him to be. He's trying to do the right thing, and that's both moving and terrifying. Because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't save anyone. And Cain, the man bringing good news, is forced to learn that complete doesn't always mean happy. The meeting ended without truly ending. As if both of them could feel they had opened a new door of pressure. They agreed quietly to go public yet, but that quiet wasn't peace. It was compression, something held down that would explode the moment it was touched. And just as Billy let himself believe he'd managed to protect Jill by keeping everything calm, his phone buzzed with a brief update about Jill's condition. That made the blood in his veins turn cold, because it suggested they might not have the luxury of choosing the right time to announce anything at all. Time might choose for them. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.